Thank you very, very much. So we've had 3 really interesting papers on various subjects, a lot of which do have overlapping connections. I throw it open to the audience. Yes.
Thank you. Hi. My question is, maybe I'll stand up so I can see you guys. So throughout all 3 talks, I was thinking about who is listening to these songs, who's reading the poems, and what is their impact ultimately. And in the first talk, we heard this sort of ideal where poems are talking about universal themes, and regardless of personal politics, they can appeal to everyone and maybe play a uniting role. But many of the examples that we heard, especially in the second and third talks, are very much, political, and they take a side very strongly. And I'm imagining that mostly people who listen to them and accept them are those who already believe whatever they're saying, and so they actually exacerbate the deep divides in Ukrainian society. So would you agree that that this kind of war poetry and war songs, they divide more than they unite? And if so, does that impact this question and we judge the value of someone's work, whatever side they're on, just the fact that they're dividing, even if we agree with what they're saying, does that kind of diminish the value of their work?
Who wants to go first?
Well, if I may, I just based my observations on that particular anthology. So this is how I read it, that it seems to me that the editors wanted to speak in that universal language, so that goes to their selection, right? Like you heard one of the editor kind of talking a little bit about that. So that's how this particular anthology came about, right? That perhaps that was their intention, to not divide but somehow unify. But that particular anthology was published here in the US, right? Only in English, so the audience is here, at least like in Anglo-speaking kind of world, right? So it's not really addressed to people back in Ukraine. So that's part of the question that you had that maybe I answered. I don't know.
If I may. So I guess I am perhaps in terms of my material better placed to answer the question about who listens to this, because at least we have the metrics of YouTube at least, and so I do operate some numbers. The easiest answer would probably be quite a lot of people. So some of the songs I have discussed today, and I wanted to show you Yermak, for example, so that rapper, Russian-speaking rapper. So his video has, I think, 2.5 million views on YouTube, around that. So some of those songs do accumulate hundreds of thousands, or in some cases, millions of views. So there's definitely a large audience consuming that product. It's a very sort of thankless thing to analyze YouTube comments. It's not a very meaningful discussion usually, but in the very least, we can learn from that discussions that people holding different opinions do come to consume the product. So in many cases, we will see that both people who support the message, if there is a politically charged message in the song, most people who support it will come to express their support. And then usually what happens is that the more popularity the song gains, the more people who disagree with this kind of message will also flock over and create a very kind of interesting discussion in the comments. But in terms of dividing or uniting, I do want to perhaps try and complicate your question a little bit, because we are in a situation where the division exists. War is a very de facto thing. So we do have parties who are killing each other. So it is very difficult to hold a position of any kind of neutrality in a situation when there are people holding different opinions who are killing each other. So that neutrality in a sense, at least in the eyes of many people, becomes morally questionable in itself. So I don't really have an answer, but I do want to add sort of that layer to your questions, that really not taking sides can be and is often perceived in the society as taking the worst possible side, almost, in a sense, as being indifferent. So the message of unity, again, when it is expressed, quite often is pushed against in the sense of unity with whom? Do we want unity with the DNR and LNR? By DNR and LNR, do we mean people who just support them explicitly, or do we mean anyone who sort of remains or chooses to remain for one reason or the other in the occupied territories, and as such can by some people be viewed as complicit with those regimes? So there are many, many complicated questions and nuances that I think should be taken into account when we attempt at least to answer this question. Thank you.
Oksana, do you want to add anything?
Well, I suppose I would only add that one way in which I think some of these poets can be helpful is to help model what neutrality could look like. Not necessarily neutrality, politically speaking, but what this middle position could even look like. Without radicalizing it and taking sides, you can reach some common understanding on the basis of other human emotions, such as empathy, for instance. Even if you know that, well, it's like the classical case, right, Antigone. Even if you know your brother did wrong, you're still going to risk your life to go and bury him because this is what the gods demand. So even though you know that somebody has taken the wrong side, you can still comprehend why they did it, and you can have enough sympathy for them to honor them as a human being who made a mistake.
Thank you. Roman Ivashkiv, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Thank you, Maria, Iryna, and Oksana for wonderful talks. I really enjoyed them. I have 3 brief questions/comments to Iryna, and please choose whichever you want to answer, or if you want to answer all of them, and I have one quick question for Oksana. So the first question to Iryna, do you have any examples of other languages being used, specifically Polish or English or any other languages you can think of, so that we kind of break out a little bit of this kind of dichotomous Russian/Ukrainian paradigm, because otherwise I was beginning to question the term multilingualism a little bit, because then to me it sounds more like bilingualism or code switching, code mixing. The second thing is, are you looking at the music styles and genres? Because you showed us a little bit of a variety there, a little bit of hip hop or trip or whatever these genres are. And thirdly, the samples that you played all contained this motif of brotherhood. The comedian Serhiy Pratula jokingly and punningly transforms this into myszy bratia. Are you also, because I understand that your interest is in language specifically, but also you must be looking at what these messages are. And to me, like, the last piece you played, "Я пойму тебя, братик, и ты зрозумієш мене." So despite everything that is happening, the myszy bratia mentality is still very deeply ingrained. And very quickly for Oksana, that's a fascinating philosophical, ethical, aesthetical question. But I was thinking, have you looked, are they translated? Are they translated into other languages? Because you've prepared a collection, English translations of those writers who you probably believe are both good writers and good people. But are these writers from the other side of the fence, so to speak, are they translated? And have you had a chance to look at it? Thank you.
If I may start, so I'll try to answer very fast as well. Thank you for the 3 great questions, really. In terms of other languages, as I've said, probably Polish does stand out as being used, not nearly as much as Russian or Ukrainian, but one example could be a joint project by 3 artists. So that's the band Haidamaka, Ukrainian band Haidamaka, Russian rock performer Andrei Makarevich, sort of a veteran of the Russian rock scene, and a veteran of the Polish rock scene, Maciej Malinchuk, who together recorded a song titled "Only Love Will Keep You Alive," which is sort of a song of this message of peace and unity, really, in the context of war. And it is created in 3 languages. Also, I must say that even in this song, the Polish component, sort of just proportionally speaking, does take the smallest part. So that's one example. We don't see much English, which is interesting in itself. It's one of the issues that I want to look at more closely, because, for example, if we look at war songs coming from the Balkan Wars, there was quite an active use of English language, specifically with the purpose to attract attention of the international community to what was going on in the Balkan countries. So there was a number of songs being recorded specifically addressed to that international community. We don't see that happening in Ukraine, which probably also tells us something about maybe how much help or intervention at this point is expected or not expected from the international community. In terms of genres, as I've said, there is a huge variety going on. I do look at them, but I would say that usually there is little alignment we can observe in terms of which genres are more common, sort of how they align with different messages. The only exception would probably be the DNR and LNR held territories. They do produce just sort of terrible music mostly, in terms of the lack of originality. So usually they just replicate the existing models it's a mix of Russian chanson usually and Soviet sort of style songs. And there is an explanation, of course, because the materials that we can hear from the DNR and LNR, the musical material, is very much top-down sort of sanctioned or created. So that's one very important thing to remember, because the materials that we can see does not really reflect the whole variety of opinions and sort of creative potential of the region, because certain opinions just really can't be openly voiced from inside that community. So it is a very sanctioned and censored process. We should remember that. And to your third question, this sort of brotherhood or unity, I mean, even Boris Sevastianov, the Russian-speaking performer from Kharkiv, whom the first videos that I played you today, he does say in one song that we grew up in the same country, we watched the same movies. How did this brotherhood sort of fell apart? So there is definitely a sense, I would say probably in sort of expressed in one way or the other by various parties in this conflict, that yes, something is falling apart, some sort of connection is being broken. And I would say that there is quite often a sense of regret on that, whether expressed in terms of the political unity being broken or the cultural ties being broken, or when we are looking at Ukrainian material, it's quite often sort of just the human component of it, like why do we have to be fighting each other when we could be doing something else. But just interesting point in terms of brotherhood specifically, there is one song which is a response to a rather famous poem, «Никогда мы не будем братьями», We Will Never Be Brothers Again, which was by a Ukrainian poet, and a response is by a Russian rap performer who creates a response, so that's a response song to that poem, saying that the message of the original poem was that we will not be brothers with you because basically you have provoked a conflict, you being Russia, broadly speaking. And the response is the final lines of this response song by a Russian performer are, we will never be brothers, because you are a sister of mine, you being Ukraine, not specifically the girl. So it's also a very gendered issue, and can be, I think this concept of brotherhood should also be looked at under that angle. Thank you, I hope it answers your questions.
Okay, we have time for one more question. There in the...
This is a controversial question. How good has the war been for poetry? In other words, are we talking about the first fruits, or are we talking about ripe fruits? And do we need a little bit of distance to really get the best literature? And the other thing that I'm thinking of is the American wars. Have they produced poetry? And I would say World War I did produce a lot of British poetry. But you don't get poetry from World War II, from the Korean War, from Vietnam, or from Iraqi war. So I'm wondering why. And I think the First World War, it was because of something totally new, this total war concept. And these other wars were wars that were fought overseas. So people are not as connected with them as the Civil Wars. So anyway, I wonder if you can answer the first question and maybe a little bit of the second question.
This is for who?
Anyone.
Oh.
Do you want to go, Maria?
Well, I just, why poetry? I think in Ukraine, like poetry, generally speaking, some would argue that, like this is the genre that it's like more pronounced, if you will, that there are more poets than good poets than good prose writers. Maybe someone would argue with that, I don't know, but that's the kind of the perception. And why certain wars kind of generate poetry while others don't. It's kind of hard to answer that question. One thing it's clear that in this particular case, we really have a lot of war poetry written, in Ukraine, right? That's evidenced by these two anthologies, and there are many poets who write, maybe not primarily, right? Obviously, anthologies always pick, if this is a thematic anthology like Words for War, and both of them actually are. So you pick certain poems from the, whole universe of whoever writes, right? And that could be a marginal part for any given poet, right? I don't know if I answer.
Is it a ripe
It's ripe. You know what I mean? It's good poetry, right? Otherwise, it would not be picked. Usually, we try to pick the best for the best poetry is anthologized. Like that's the kind of like the principle, I would say. So that's how I would kind of answer your question.
I think these are ripe poets. So it happened in this way that when the war broke out, these ripe poets were ready to take on the task and to write this poetry. And in that way, the project is quite different from, say, what Iryna is doing, which is more immediate on the ground writing and songwriting by the amateurs. And that maybe is its own tradition, quite different from this war poetry that had been written by people who had a lot of experience writing beforehand about other topics.
Okay, I think we'll have to close on that note. Mark Andrzejczyk is a very stern taskmaster. I want to thank the panelists for 3 really great talks and some really nice questions from the audience as well. So on that note, I think we have 3:30, we begin again.
Thank you.